Oh, hey there. Let me ask you a question. When you finish playing a game, are you ever fully satisfied with it? When people ask your opinions about said title, do you say things like, "Oh, I loved it," and "It was great," and just leave it at that? Or are you more like me and end those statements with a subtle "but" in preparation to talk about all the things that you didn't like? If you do the latter, have you ever thought about why? Because I certainly have. Obviously, I like talking about video games, or I wouldn't be, sitting here talking about video games. But if you've been watching me for a while, or if you've just found the channel, then you may have realized that I typically only talk about things that I genuinely like. I've mentioned this before in past videos, but the general reason as to why is because I just find it to be more interesting to talk about things that you're genuinely passionate about, as opposed to ranting about something that you loathe. If you don't like something, you could simply move on from it, right? Well, yes. But things aren't always that black and white. For a long time, whenever I'd be praising a specific game with some friends, be it something newer or something older, I'd always find myself throwing the word "but" at the end of said praise before discussing every little critique that I have. Next thing I know, the conversation where we were praising a game because it was awesome has become a conversation where we're just complaining about it. It's pretty wild when you think about it, because it probably happens a lot more often than I'd like. It's not just with video games either. Movies, shows, all of them can easily fall victim to the dreaded "but" at the end of any amount of praise, which leads me to asking myself, why? This wasn't something I always did, mind you. When I was a kid, I accepted entertainment at face value. I took the bad with the good, and that was that. In fact, I often ignored the bad, which is probably how I'm able to have such strong nostalgia for games that I know aren't exactly the best in the eyes of the general public. So, what changed? Well, it's human nature to often remember the bad more often than we remember the good. All of us are guilty of this. When a bad moment happens in your otherwise pretty good day, we tend to fixate on it. It stands out, and it's the thing we end up talking about. Sure, we could talk about how we had a pretty normal good day, but instead, 9 times out of 10, we end up talking about that one bad moment, even if it was the dumbest thing, like someone backing out directly in front of you in a Target parking lot. There have been numerous studies on this, with the general hypothesis being that the reasoning could just be a leftover evolutionary defense mechanism. Therefore, when bad things happen, they stick out more in our memory in an attempt to help us prevent the same situation in the future. It's not exactly useful anymore, similar to how dogs spin around in circles a million times before laying down, but it's so ingrained in us now that it's bleeding over into how we share our experiences with video games or other forms of entertainment. I want to be clear here that this is not absolute fact, and that last statement was purely my own speculation on it. But I do believe that there are some loose threads that tie these things together. But that still doesn't answer the question of what changed, does it? After all, kids are just as susceptible to remembering the bad more often than good as adults are. In fact, we call that trauma. However, unlike adults, kids haven't had nearly as many experiences yet. Their expectations of what games are and what games can be is severely limited compared to someone who's been playing games for 20 or 30 years of their life. Everything is awesome because they don't have anything else to compare it to. Inevitably, the more experiences you have, the more you start to compare those experiences with and against each other. You start to see similarities between different games, but slowly start to realize you prefer how Game A does combat over Game B, but that Game B definitely has better music than Game C. Rinse and repeat this process for a decade or 3, and if you're not careful, you'll find you've turned into a gamer with a capital G. I realize I'm not saying anything groundbreaking here. Ultimately, this boils down to me making an observation about myself and coming to the realization that I don't want to be a certain way and slowly trying to correct it. For instance, did you know that I had planned on reviewing Final Fantasy 16 on this channel? Because I did, but then I didn't. Why? Well, because of this entire problem. I know I haven't talked about Final Fantasy much in this channel, but I have played a vast majority of the series, spin-offs included. I'll say that I do prefer the earlier titles, because I'm just more of a fan of classic turn-based RPGs over action RPGs, but that hasn't stopped me from playing the more recent games. When 16 was coming out, I avoided practically everything about it. I didn't have much of a desire to jump in right away, but I did try the demo, and I gotta say, it sold the entire game for me. After I played the demo, I went ahead and pre-ordered the game. I was pretty excited when it arrived, and I played it a lot from the get-go. I did everything too. I even got the Platinum Trophy, which means that I played through the game 2 full times, the second time being on the hardest difficulty. So one would assume that I really enjoyed the game, right? Well, I did. And yet, when I went to write my script about it, I just kept thinking about all the negatives. Whenever I talk about the game with friends, instead of praising this game I put well over 100 hours of my life into, I just complain about things I didn't like. What I would have changed, where I think they fumbled, what could have been improved, etc. I started to have a bit of a dilemma, because I realized Final Fantasy XVI fell victim to the, oh, I really liked it, but syndrome. And I just didn't want to be that way. Before I continue, some of you might be thinking, but yeah, isn't pointing out a game's flaws part of reviewing it? And yes, you are absolutely right. I fully realize there's a bit of hypocrisy in what I'm saying, but sometimes you just want to enjoy things, you know? This sort of falls into that whole you can't have your cake and eat it too region. When I talk to my friends about video games, they're talking to me, AJ, their friend, about a game. They're not coming to world famous YouTube superstar SimplyAJ for his opinions. Not everything needs a review. Not everything needs to be some sort of critical analysis. And I think sometimes it's just hard for me, personally, to turn that off. I'm keenly aware of when I do it though, which is why I've been trying to just enjoy games and not look at them through a microscope at every given opportunity. Since we're currently living in this internet age with numerous social media platforms and everyone being connected to everyone else, people have a lot more platforms to share their opinions on. But the problem with opinions is that they sometimes exist alongside our own egos. Your ego wants to be right. And therefore, if someone talks about how great something is that you found to be not great, there's a chance that you'll want to correct them. That way you, yourself, can feel like you're in the right. This is extremely obvious by simply looking at the replies to someone's opinion about a game on Twitter, or, you know, just perusing the YouTube comment section on literally any video ever. The more you fall into this type of behavior, where your ego can be shattered simply because someone else found enjoyment in something that you yourself did not, the less likely you will be to enjoy things in the future. You find yourself falling so deep into those, it was good, but statements that you forgo even mentioning the good, and suddenly you're just hyper fixated on something you hate. Sometimes this happens because you're extremely passionate about a game or a series and you just don't like the direction it's gone in, which I can definitely relate to. But you can't let that passion turn you into an ass either. I have a lot of opinions about Final Fantasy XVI, just like I have a lot of opinions about every other game that I've played. Some of them may make the channel and others won't. Like I've said, I know that most of the games that I've covered on this channel are games that I genuinely liked, so they might lack a bit of that critical analysis in some aspects. But sometimes it's just so refreshing to not be so hyper critical about things that you genuinely enjoy. That's not to say that I won't do a more critical take on various games in the future. It's entirely possible. In fact, at some point in time, I would love to do a critical review of The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, because it's a game that I truly loved, but at the same time feel there's a lot of things I could talk about that should have been changed or improved. I think the point of this video may have gotten away from me a little bit, but hopefully some of you were able to follow my ramblings. The point being that it's okay to just enjoy a game. Not everything has to be a review, and not everything has to be a critical analysis. I'm not saying don't talk about a game's flaws, but that sometimes you might enjoy a game more if you don't focus so heavily on those flaws. Or hell, better yet, if you accept that a game can be good with those flaws, because perfect doesn't really exist. Being critical of things from time to time is fine. Hell, it can even be fun. But if you're always critical, you can become an absolute drag, and you'd be surprised how quickly people like that can just suck the fun from a conversation. So with that all said, tell me about a game in the comments that you really liked that you often found yourself ending with the word but. Except this time, just tell me why that game fucking rules. The last person to comment gets pinned for all of eternity. because I'm just more of a fan of classic turn-based RPGs over action RPGs.
I didn't do that. She just did it.
She said, I'm here too.